18. As the days passed and the case dragged on inconclusively, Steve Gonsalves struggled to make sense of his emotions. In the agonized aftermath of his daughter Kaylee's murder, Steve, his wife, and their remaining children had been brought low. But more demonstratively than the others in the family, his anger, as displayed in his public utterances, spewed out raw and unfettered. One day he railed with an uncomprehending anguish at the injustice of it all. "You can't imagine sending your girl to college and they come back in an urn," he grieved openly to a group of reporters. "You're numb. You can't absorb that amount of pain and agony." Next, he chose to scorn the capricious, faltering manner with which, he had decided, law enforcement had been attempting to solve the murders. "I do not feel confident," he responded with a vehement candor when asked on a news show what he thought about the police investigation. "And that's why I push the envelope and say a little more." Yet even as he made himself available to nearly every journalist who reached out to him, Steve couldn't help feeling, he confided to a friend, that all his heartfelt proclamations, everything he had been calling truths, added up to little more than a sort of self-indulgence. His public sharing of his anguish and misgivings gave him little comfort. "I hate to be that guy," he would say. More disheartening, after all his years as a father, of devoting himself full-time to what he thought best for his children, he was confronted with the devastating reality that there was nothing more he could do for Kaylee. And, hand in hand with that, another sorrow. He couldn't identify a clear-headed strategy to lead his grieving family forward. Never had he been so unprepared, and yet never had his family needed him so much. He was at a loss. For weeks he had been struggling. No dogma, only emotions. It was as if he'd been letting himself be tossed around by the surging waves of breaking news. But now, finally, he knew what he would do. He would do it because for a father no sacrifice is too great, and a father's duty to his child never ends, not even with her death. He would do it because while he was a man alone, with his family's support and assistance, they became a force whose commitment and focus was greater than anything the so-called authorities could muster. He would do it because to walk any other path would be weakness, or even cowardice. He would join the hunters. He would solve the case. And he would do it because it was what his beloved KK would have done, and had, in fact, tried to do. October 5th, 2021 had been a surprisingly cool Tuesday in Moscow, a day when the sudden drop in temperature was the first unwanted reminder that a glorious Indian summer was over, and the northwest winter would soon be closing in. Yet undeterred by the chill, as soon as she'd finished her last class, Kaylee convinced her boyfriend, Jack DeCoeur, to accompany her to the Walmart Supercenter on Pullman Road. The warehouse store was vast and unattractive, sitting atop acres of black asphalt parking lanes like a stolid concrete fortress. But it had a lot of stuff. You could find pretty much anything, and Kaylee loved to shop. The two students had been wandering through the maze of harshly lit aisles when Kaylee first noticed the grandmotherly woman. She had pale, stringy hair and the bewildered look of someone trapped in a situation she couldn't quite understand. But more unnerving was the animal straightness of the woman's stare. She fixed her gaze on Kaylee and held it, way past anything that could be considered polite, or for that matter normal. It wasn't threatening, but nevertheless it was decidedly odd. Then when Kaylee and Jack were at the checkout counter, she happened to look up absently, only to discover that the woman, now standing at rigid attention with her back to a wall of shelves, had once again homed in on her with the same unremitting stare. It was creepy. What was up with her? Kaylee wondered. Hours later, she knew. She had just seen the face again, this time on a missing persons flyer. The woman, Kaylee was convinced, was Sharon Archer, a frail 62-year-old suffering from acute diabetes and brain damage who had abruptly vanished a week earlier from the house she shared with her husband up north in Coeur d'Alene. The couple's car, a 2013 white Toyota Highlander, was missing too. No one knew what had happened, and in the absence of real information, increasingly feverish internet speculations flourished. The scenarios ran the gamut from a mental breakdown to more fanciful schemes involving abduction or murder. But now Kaylee knew. And at 10:25 that night, just moments after all the pieces had clicked into place in her mind, Kaylee promptly telephoned the Moscow Police Department. She spoke to Sergeant Dustin Blaker, telling him she was convinced she'd spotted the woman, and then, for good measure, she sent an email with the missing persons notice attached. Despite the late hour, the sergeant, a barrel-chested weightlifter with just over a year on the force, conscientiously went to work. Officers were dispatched to the Walmart parking lot, and they combed the dark recesses for a telltale Toyota. At the same time, calls were made to local hotels asking if a woman matching Sharon Archer's description had checked in. Both searches were futile, and accessing the Walmart surveillance camera videos proved to be problematic. It had to be postponed until the next day, and then it, too, turned out to be another dead end. As it happened, it wasn't Kaylee's call that solved the mystery. More than 2 anxious weeks passed before an angler perched on a dock noticed a bulky shape entombed in the lead-gray depths of Fernan Lake, a popular fishing spot about a 10-minute drive from downtown Coeur d'Alene. When police lifted a white Toyota Highlander from the water, a body lay inside. The autopsy identified the corpse as Sharon Archer, and while the specific circumstances of her grim death remain conjectural, no foul play has ever been charged. The investigation petered out, soon to be overtaken by fresh tragedies. Only now Steve found himself recalling his daughter's attempt to solve that mystery, and it had dawned on him that just as Kaylee had unhesitatingly thrown herself into the investigation, he had a responsibility too. He was caught up in a true crime story, and prodded by his daughter's example, he would act. He would play the detective. Sweeping all the extraneous emotional debris cluttering his mind aside, deciding to live by his wits, he went on the hunt. Working with Olivia, his oldest daughter, Steve began checking out Kaylee's phone for clues. The two of them went through the list of contacts, reached out to Kaylee's friends, and helped to reconstruct the last hours of his daughter's and her best friend Maddie's last hours, and shared them with the authorities. They also discovered the persistent series of calls in the wee hours of the morning from Kaylee to her ex-boyfriend Jack DeCoeur, calls that had gone unanswered. Steve quickly passed that intelligence, too, onto the cops. When the Moscow PD summarily hooked Jack up to a lie detector and administered a DNA swab to compare with evidence at the crime scene, he passed both examinations, according to one of Steve's friends. Steve, however, was not completely assuaged. Nothing about the murders made any sense, and so everything seemed possible. Suspicions lay claim to his thoughts. When a grieving Jack came to the Gonsalves' home not long after the events to pay his respects, Steve gravely demanded that the young man submit to the indignity of a physical inspection. Jack promptly rolled up his sleeves, lifted his shirt, exposed his neck, displayed his hands, palms up and down, while Steve meticulously searched in vain for a telltale scratch or bruise. But Steve was not done. Caught up in his newfound forensic professionalism, he took a series of photographs documenting Jack's unblemished state. It was exculpatory evidence that would come in handy, he felt, as the authorities proceeded to compile their list of suspects. And with that bit of awkward business out of the way, the two grieving men finally embraced. In the days that followed, Steve tracked down Hunter Johnson, Chapin's close friend. Just before noon on November 13th, Johnson, incredibly prior to even the police having been notified, had been summoned by the two distraught survivors to the King Road house. He had discovered Ethan's body, and now he gave his eyewitness account to Steve as a soldier might, straightforward, factual, and without embellishment or emotion. It was only when he finished that the two men, both overwhelmed, at last convulsed into tears. Steve also made a point of knocking on the doors of the houses adjacent to the murder scene and interrogating neighbors. And he had posted on Facebook asking if anyone had any information. He was going where he felt he had to go, but his mission had not produced the desired results. Weeks had passed, and there had been no arrests. The authorities had not even named a suspect. It was infuriating. The prospect of his daughter's murder becoming one more cold case was a torture. But as much as he needed to see a perp being let off in handcuffs, he was also chasing after something else. He needed to know. Why? Why these kids? Why this house? Why had this nightmare enveloped his family's life? For his own peace of mind, he required a motive. And without this knowledge, nothing in his life from November 13th onward would ever make sense. It was, he'd let people know, those currents of frustration and perplexity that pushed him to double down on his detective's mission. He made up his mind to reach out to more people and to proclaim his new ambitious vocation more directly. He would make a public appeal. Steve was certain that even if the police had failed to locate them, there had to be people out there who knew more than they were sharing. Someone, particularly a student with some dodgy antics to hide, might be more willing to whisper secrets to a mourning father than to the judgmental police. With this plan in mind, Steve reached out to Olivia Vitale.